So it's great to be back in the lectionary. You know, we've had a couple of guest speakers over the last couple of weeks, Daphne and Alana, and that was fantastic. And before that, we had Easter. So it's been quite a while since I've had the chance to preach and get back into the lectionary and working through from the sort of set scriptures that preachers can work from. But this week's ones were great. My favourite parts of the Bible are the narratives. You know, there's the teachings and the parables, and they're awesome. And then there's, the promises, and then there's the Psalms and all the wisdom literature, and that's great. But what I really resonate the most with are the narratives. You know, I love reading biographies. I love reading autobiographies where you can see somebody's life and all the great bits of it, but also all the warts and the scars and, all the downsides of it. And it's the same is true for the Bible. I love reading the biblical narratives because you get to see how did this character respond? How did God build into their life? And it's really great. You can learn so much from the Bible just looking at the lives. And we certainly shouldn't be doing everything that every character did in the Bible, but we can learn from their mistakes. And so when this week I was looking at the lectionary, we had 2 Corinthians 6, Mark 4, Job 38, and 1 Samuel 17. And they are 4 great narratives. And so what I want to do, if you were to randomly pick 4 narratives out of the Bible, you couldn't find 4 more diverse narratives. They really are quite different. So I'm going to look at that. We're going to see how these people lived out their faith and then how it impacted others. And then, as I said, we've got these 3 chairs here. And I'm going to finish the sermon with an example of how we need to live out our lives so that others can see. So first up, let's see what shaped their lives, and I'll start in 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17 is the climax of the story between David and Goliath. This is a story of one young man's faith against the best fighter in the world at that point. And, you could pick any of the other narratives in the Bible. Story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is the same story, one man against a mob. Peter before the crowd in Acts, again, it's one person standing with their faith against the crowd. Noah in front of the mob in Genesis. The Bible is replete with story after story of one man standing for their faith and God coming through for them. But what I love about how the Bible tells the story of David and Goliath is that David, first of all, gives his testimony to the king at the time. He's saying that in his youth, he's protected the sheep, he's used his sling. This is how God's developed him. This is how God has built his natural gifts and abilities. And he ends up giving this amazing testimony on his way through to fighting the battle. And in one sense, it's almost presented as if the battle was a foregone conclusion. There's an author that I have read a couple of books from, and he retells the story of David and Goliath. But he spends a whole chapter in sort of retelling the lead up, how about many decades before, or a decade before, David had chosen to follow Yahweh, and how decades before Goliath had chosen to follow a false god called Dagon, and how David had drawn closer to God, and how David had built up his skills and abilities, and how Goliath had tried to do the same thing. But then as this author retells the story, he gets to what we would expect to be the climax, and he just finishes it with, and David took his head. It's like, how can that be the climax? But what he was getting at was, it was almost a foregone conclusion. Decades ago, David had chosen to follow God and had walked faithfully in that. And the conclusion had already been set. Of course God was going to come through when he retells this story. Of course God was. What we see in David is one experience of faith where he had fought small battle after small battle after small battle. And that had built his faith, it had built his resilience, it had built his courage and his skills until when he confronted Goliath. We look back at it now and go, that was an amazing thing. But David wasn't surprised. David just saw it as one more outworking of what God was doing in his life. We look back now and think it was a miracle that, that sling hit Goliath exactly where it needed to. We think that was a God-ordained miracle. From one view, it was. But from David's view, it was just the natural outworking of a life always trusting God. For him, it was no different to hitting a bear or a coyote with a sling. I think that it gives us also just a great picture of spiritual gifts and how spiritual gifts are to work. David had been walking with God faithfully and using the skills and abilities that he'd given in the natural sense. He'd learned how to use a sling. He'd learned how to be quick on his feet. He'd learned some of these, what we'd sort of term natural gifts. But then God came in and supernaturally blessed it. You know what? He did guide it, so it was that first rock did the job. He gave David favor with the king, so he was allowed to go out and even try and beat him. He had been faithful with what God had given him, and then God had blessed it. And I think it's a perfect picture of how spiritual gifts are meant to work for us in our life. I firmly believe that God has given a spiritual gift of preaching and teaching to me. But is it enough for me just to stand up here on a Sunday and preach? Or do I have to put in the effort of reading the Bible, listening to other great preachers, reading how to be a better preacher, listening to my own sermons and critiquing, having other preachers around? When God gives a spiritual gift, we are to hone it. We are to practice in it and get better and better, and use every gift that God has given us. And there are so many parables, parable of the talents being the prime one, where we are to use what God gives us. But then when I stand up here on a Sunday, I also have to expect that God will do something more than I could have. God makes me better than I could be. And I know that it's not all on me, and so I'm not crippled with that fear of failure. But I think for every one of us, we have a spiritual gift that God has given us, and it's on us to partner with God in doing something extraordinary with that. And I see that's the story of David. David just kept faithfully using what God had given him. And then God did something extraordinary with it. And it's this great lesson that we can take from David. So for David, that's that one story where everything seemed to go right. And that's one person's journey of faith. But then on the other spectrum, the next lectionary reading for this day was Job 38. Now, I've preached on Job before. Everybody's familiar with the story of Job? Yeah. Everybody's familiar with the story of Job, and where David's faith had grown through small battle after small trial until he could take on anything, and his faith was rock solid. Job had the opposite. Job, we are told in Job chapter 1, had lived a blessed or a sheltered life. He had been protected. God had given him everything that he ever needed, and then some. He was one of the wealthiest people in the land of Uz. But when trials come, it becomes very quickly the story of one man hanging on to his faith by the thinnest of threads. It's a scarlet thread of faith. He still believes that God is in control. He just doesn't know if he can trust God anymore. He doesn't know if God is actually good. And if you want to see the picture of a God follower battling with depression and battling with all sorts of fears and all sorts of negative thoughts about God, start reading in Job chapter 2 and read through to Job chapter 37. These are some of the darkest passages and darkest language in all of Scripture. And Job goes from fairly questioning God and saying, God, is this truly right? God, are you the type of God that allows this to happen? To by the time you get to Job 37, he is just railing on God. And he is saying, God, I wish I could take you to court. He is. Job is taking up the prosecutor's role and saying, God, you are not being fair. I want you to come down here and answer me, is what he is declaring for those last 6 or 7 chapters, Job 30 through Job 37. And then Job 38, the lectionary reading for today. This is how it starts. Job, brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. See, Job had thought that he gets to accuse God. And God says, okay, you want a court case? That's fine. But I'm the prosecutor. I will be asking the questions, thank you very much. Now, we know that Job was somebody in whom God found favour. If you read the last chapter of Job, you actually find out, things were restored. Job had a deeper understanding of who God was. There are some reasons, the reason for why Job suffered, he never finds out. And for us, we can take that as great encouragement. You know what? For us, there is going to be suffering and pain in our life. And we can look at Scripture and see, you know what? Sometimes this side of eternity, we don't get to find out why. But that didn't stop Job from trusting and growing in his relationship with God. In fact, it brought him deeper. He got to see what kind of generous God really was. And that was enough for him. And when he got to leave this world and go to be with God forever, I think that he would have understood why God let him go through that. But then in one sense, pain and suffering are gone, so he wouldn't really have dwelt on it. He was now with God, and that was enough. When I read through this, there are two things that I'm constantly reminded of, and one of these was actually a long growing thing for me. The first thing I'm reminded of is that even when I don't understand, and when the hits keep coming, and none of us here have suffered as badly as Job did, but even when those hits keep coming, God knows more than we do. His plans are infinitely better. Job tells us that we can complain, we can challenge God. One of the authors that I've read, he actually said, rage is so dangerous. The only place for it is before God. If you want to rail about how unfair something is, if you want to do something about that, we have like the penitential psalms where people are just railing against God. But at least that's a healthy expression to get it out of their system, and they're engaging with God. So you know what? If things aren't fair, take it up with God. Tell God. He knows what's in your heart anyway. Hiding it's not going to do any good. He already knows it's there. Express it, vent it, get it out. And then engage with God and wait for the answer. Wait for him to respond. And sometimes he'll actually let you know what's going on, and sometimes he won't. But it's okay. He's still in control, and his plans are still better. That's what we learn from Job. The second lesson, which I think is actually the author's point in Job, is that when people are suffering, don't just jump in and blame them. Job's friends, he's got 3 friends, they get blasted by God because they came along and say, hey Job, if you're suffering, you must have done something evil. You must have done something wrong. This is all your fault, Job. If you're suffering, it's your fault. No. God was doing something amazing in Job's life. In fact, if you read Job 1, you actually find out that he had found favor with God. God was working in somebody who he favored the most, and he let him go through the most suffering in order to teach us very valuable lessons. So when people are suffering, sometimes, yes, we do bring pain on ourselves. Somebody that smokes for 50 or 60 years, no wonder there are health concerns. Sometimes we do bring pain on ourselves, but we don't get to judge somebody's faith or faithfulness by the condition that their life is in, because God may be doing something else. So that's what we can learn from Job. Suffering can bring us closer to God, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're far away from him. Then this third story. The third story is out of Mark, and it's the story of Jesus and the storm, and Jesus quietening the storm. I love these stories. We often speak about, being in the same boat as somebody. This was literally the disciples being in the same boat as Jesus. And a boat that would have been at most the size of the carpeted area here at church. Probably a bit smaller. So you imagine being in a boat that large, made of wood, only powered by sail, out in the middle of Moreton Bay. when a storm kicks up. And not just a little storm, not just Redcliffe ripples, but a cyclone, and how afraid you would be. This is the story. And the disciples are panicking, and they're trying to keep it under control, and then they just wake Jesus up and say, "Don't you care?" And how does he respond? "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Now, who thinks, who thinks that that's not quite fair on the disciples? Who here, I don't think that was fair. If I was in a boat with Jesus in the middle of a storm, I think the first thing I would do would be wake Jesus up. I think that's a perfectly valid response. So why does Jesus say, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" It doesn't seem fair, does it? I think to get the context of this, you have to read back through that chapter of Mark chapter 4. If you look at the Mark chapter 4 and some of the preceding verses as well, this is quite an enigma. You have the parable of the sower, the parable of light under a basket, parable of the growing seed, parable of the mustard seed, a summary that says, "And Jesus told more parables," and then Jesus explaining the use of parables. Are we seeing a pattern here as to what Mark 4 is normally about? It's Jesus teaching. It's Jesus teaching on the kingdom and Jesus teaching through parables. That's all of what chapter 4 is. And then they get in a boat and they get in a storm. The authors of the Bible tended to structure things sometimes chronologically, but sometimes they'd pull everything together. And so here's all the parables together, and here's the actions that Jesus did, and they pull them together so it's easier for us to understand. So why, when Mark was pulling together all of his writings later in his life to write the Gospel of Mark, did he put this verse in with all the parables? Why? Now, I believe it's because, this aberration, this hiccup, is because Jesus has been teaching about the kingdom. And you can just imagine the disciples have been there going, "Yes, Jesus, that's great teaching." I'm a preacher. I stand up here. Sometimes when I make a good point, I see people's heads nod. Okay? You just have to imagine the disciples would have been doing the same thing. Jesus speaks, "The kingdom of heaven, it's like a mustard seed." And the disciples are going, yeah, Jesus, I trust you on that. "The kingdom of heaven, it's like the pearl of great price." Or, no, the kingdom of heaven, it's like a sower sowing seed. And, and some of the seed is good and all of the seed's good and some of it goes on bad soil. And you can see the disciples going, "Yeah, Jesus, I trust you in that. Yeah, Jesus, I have faith that you're right. Jesus, I know yes, that's what the kingdom is. Yes, Jesus, I can trust you with that." So they're saying that, yes, Jesus, we trust you about the kingdom. Yes, Jesus, we trust you about our eternal lives. Yes, Jesus, we trust you when you say to us that our lives need to keep growing. Yes, Jesus, we trust you in all that. And then Jesus said, "We're going to the other side of the lake." The disciples get into the boat, so they're obviously saying that they trust him. "Hey, we believe you can get us to the other side of the boat." But then storms come up. The clouds gather. The waves kick up. They're halfway between here and Moreton Island, and, perhaps the sail starts to tear. Do they still have faith in Jesus' words that they will get to the other side? No. You see, they were willing to trust Jesus when it was abstract. When Jesus was talking about the parable of the kingdom, about all these parables of the kingdom, they were ready to trust Jesus with those sort of abstract teachings. It's very easy to trust Jesus with, God is love. Love your neighbor. It's very easy to trust Jesus when he gives us those sort of vague instructions. But when he tells us something and it doesn't look like it's going to pass, where is our faith? Is our faith in the boat and in the storm, or is our faith in Jesus? And I think that's why Mark puts this story here after all of the parables. Our faith needs to mean something. If we just say yes to all the nice pithy sayings that we can put up on Facebook, if we just say yes to the politically correct parts of the Bible, and yet we don't trust Jesus when he asks us to do something difficult, or to have faith when it doesn't look like it's going to work, then do we really have faith in Jesus, or do we just have faith in the easy bits of what he said? It's a very confronting verse when we look at it in the context of what the disciples were believing and what they weren't. Now, the great news is two of these parables were the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the growing seed. Their faith did grow. Their faith continued to grow as they walked with Jesus. Every time they said yes to Jesus, their faith grew that little bit more, became more rugged, and they were able to say yes to Jesus easier the next time. And it's the same with our faith. And 3 years later, even after Jesus has left them and ascended, they are willing to literally go to the ends of the earth for him. And all but one of them are martyred. So we know that our faith is a growing thing, and we need to just keep saying yes to God. Yes, yes, yes. I was actually thinking about the song Yes and Amen. It's a great song that we could have sung today. You know, when God makes a promise and calls us, his answer is yes. That's what our response needs to be. But you see, their faith grew, and they did extraordinary things throughout the rest of the New Testament as their faith grew. And never again would it be said of them, O ye of little faith. So we can compare David and the disciples and Job, and we see three very different expressions of faith, and as it grew. And then we move on to this final story, and this one sits a little bit awkwardly. 2 Corinthians 6. 2 Corinthians 6 is most well known for the back half of the verse. You know, do not be unequally yoked. You know, those sort of classic verses. Don't be unequally yoked. Make sure you're not yoked with an unbeliever. That's the second part of 2 Corinthians 6, and it's been preached for romance and marriage, sex, business partnerships, ministry, education, politics. You know, the back half of 2 Corinthians 6 has been used to preach for all of those. I've done it too. But the first half of 2 Corinthians 6 tends to get overlooked sometimes. But that's what the lectionary is today. So I'll just read it, and then we'll put it in context, and I'm going to get to these three chairs that I've got sitting up front. Who here had forgotten about the chairs? Okay. This is 2 Corinthians 6, starting from verse 1 through to 13. As God's co-workers, this is Paul writing, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, in the time of my favour I heard you. In the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favour, and now is the day of salvation. We've put no stumbling block in anyone's path, so that our ministry will not be discredited. Rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardship and distress, in beatings, imprisonment and riots, in hard work, sleepless nights and hunger, in purity, understanding, patience and kindness, in the Holy Spirit and in sincere love, in truthful speech and in the power of God, with weapons of righteousness in the right hand and in the left, through glory, through dishonour, through bad report and good report, genuine, yet regarded as impostors, known, yet regarded as unknown, dying and yet living on, beaten, but yet not killed, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affections from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak to you as children. Open wide your hearts also. It's this plea from, he says he speaks to them as children. Open wide their hearts. It's this plea from somebody who sees himself as the father of their faith, to open up and to follow the model that him and his companions have set. The context for this is that if you read through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they're almost case studies for troubles that can pop up in a church. You know what? Gossip can hold back a church. Sexual impurity can hold back a church. Squabbles can hold back a church. Like, there's this case study in 1st and 2nd Corinthians for things that can take a church off the rails. Paul's heart and his passion is to get rid of all of these things from Corinth so that their ministry, the outworking of their faith, can be all that God had designed it to be. So that's the context you have to look at this in. So when he's listing off his hardships, it's not out of boasting. You have to view it as if it was a father sharing with their son and their daughter. This is what our faith has looked like. This is what we have gone through to preach this to you. Remember that. This is the struggles that we've gone through in order for you to be able to do your ministry, your mission. That is as he's sharing this. It's not just some quibble, oh, my emotions are hurt. No, it's a father sharing, this is what I've gone through, this is what God's gone through to give you guys the best shot. Take it on board. And I believe that this is a great example for us to follow. I've got these 3 chairs up here. I'll just pull them forward a bit for the video. Every one of us that's got a faith story will have experienced these 3 chairs. You see, when we tell the story of David, David had grown in his faith, but then all of Israel was brought closer to God through David's actions and through modelling off of him. When we look at the disciples who were in that boat, Christ had brought them to faith, and they lived their life, and now we model our lives off of the disciples, don't we? We try, at least in part. Same for Paul, sorry. And when we're going through those darkest days, if you read through all of Job, and it's a hard slog, but I hope you do at least once. If you read through all of Job, you see that his friends and what was left of his family and Job himself are drawn closer to God through those struggles. And we can look back now and see how somebody who went before us in the faith can encourage us now and can be a witness going on. But I wanted to talk about these 3 chairs because if we break that down, this is the first one from your point of view. There is the person who came before us. I'd like you to think, who came before you in faith? Who can you look back on and think, this is the person in whom I saw Christ. This is the person in whom following Christ seemed more attractive than any other alternative. This is the person who taught me about God. This is the person who taught me how to live as a Christ follower. For all of us, we will have at least one person sitting in this chair, if not more. I'd like you to think, for you, who was that? For me, I can look back and think of 4 people. There were obviously an entire church and an entire school and youth group and other instances that God brought across my path. But there were 4 people who were very intentional at living those lives, giving me those faith experiences like we saw in the Bible of drawing me closer to God. The first 2 were obviously my parents. They were great parents. I love them. Great parents. Best a kid could ask for. But they intentionally set out to draw me closer to God. When we were learning how to read, you know what stories we were reading? The Bible stories. When me and my brothers were teenagers and in a youth group, my dad would be the first one to get in trouble using the fire hose at youth group in a water fight. Now, he got in trouble from the church leadership and he got in trouble from the Redcliffe Fireys. But 20 years on, I'm still remembering that. Following Christ can be a lot of fun. That's a memory that's stuck in my head. My mum gave me this passion for learning and for teaching. And as a psychologist, she started to show me how one person truly can make a difference by teaching and informing others, and especially teaching and informing others about God. So my parents were very intentional in modelling a life where I saw Christ championed. The third person was Mark. You know, Mark started being my pastor when I was grade 8, grade 9. And he would intentionally come in and challenge and say, you know what, Brad, that's not right. You know, Brad, you're a teenager. You think you know everything, but you know what? You don't. You need to be taken down a peg or two, Brad. And over 20 years, he's still doing that. And it's great. But he's continually building into my life and modelling, you know, what Christ is like, and showing me if I go off the rails. And so he's been very intentional with that, and I think it's a perfect picture of discipleship. It's not just getting somebody across this line of faith. It's then walking with them and making them more Christ-like, even as they follow Christ. And so these are really long-term relationships. But then there was a fourth. It was a very short-term relationship, only about 3 years. But boy, it made an impact. And that was actually with Danny, Beck's dad. You see, I'd grown up in a Christian family. I had Mark as a mentor. But I was in that sort of stage of Christendom when I was saying all the right things and acting all the right way, but didn't actually have a relationship with Christ. And Danny was my youth pastor at the time, and he saw something. He saw that. Okay. I don't know how long he'd been a youth pastor before he met me, but obviously enough experience to know what was going on. And he just bold-faced called me on it. You know, he came up to me, Brad, one day. He's very sneakily. He comes up and says, Brad, I'd like you to give your testimony. Okay, Danny, yeah, sure, fine. That's what's expected. I'll give my testimony. 2 weeks later, nothing. 3 weeks later, nothing. Hey, Brad, where's that testimony? Oh, it's coming, Danny. 4 weeks. 5 weeks. About 6 weeks, Danny comes up to me. Brad, you don't have a testimony, do you? No. He could see that I was living this life and I was pretending, or I was saying all the right things, but I wasn't actually listening to God. I didn't actually have this relationship with him. I'd never actually invited God and said, hey, you know what, God, you can be first in my life. And Danny called me on that. You know, and actually forced me to look and say, you know, yeah, actually you're right. I haven't been putting God first. I've just been doing things to keep my parents happy. I've been doing things to keep Mark happy. But I've never actually given my life to God and said, God, you're in control. And Danny and I prayed. And yeah, my life has never been the same since. And the very next day, Rebecca actually ran up and basically mugged me in the school as brother and sister in Christ. She just ran up to me. I don't know if you still remember. Long time ago, it was like 22 years ago, and she ran up and just celebrated. And those memories still stay with me. For all of us, we will have at least one, probably many more, of people that have come before us in the faith. And we can look at their lives and look and see what they did. What made Christ attractive in them? What did they teach me? What did I learn from them? What did they model to me that I can take on board to be more like Christ? All of us have at least one of those stories. But in having that story, we become that story for the next person. If this is the person who went before us in faith, then this chair is for us. This is our life. Are we living a life where we are doing so knowing that other people may be looking on? When Job or Peter or Paul or any of the disciples, when David in the Bible, were they living a life knowing that it would be recorded for future for future reading? Or were they just living a life following Christ, following God, Yahweh in the Old Testament, and we look back on it now? Are we mindful that whatever life we are living is a story that somebody else is going to see? You know, do we take our faith seriously enough so that when people look at our lives and look how we're living, they notice a difference and they can see, you know what? That is attractive. That lifestyle is the one that I want. That following Christ is better than anything that I could be living. When people look at us, even without speaking to us, do they know that there's something different? You know what? I'm sure that whilst my parents were intentional and Mark was intentional, I picked up a lot more about what they said, about what they did, than what they said. Now, I could see how they were living, and I was following that, not necessarily just what they were saying. Do we live our Christian life the same way so that people who are wanting to follow Christ could look at us as Christ followers and do likewise? One of my friends from uni, he would never have darkened the doors of a church, but he was surrounded by 4 or 5 Christian guys and he didn't even know it at first. But as he started to live the same life that we were living, he started to get drawn closer to not just the morality and the ethics of Christ, but of our relationship with him. And now he's married this great Christian girl and they're going to a Catholic church down in Nudgee somewhere. And I'm sure we did talk to him over the years about Christ, but he would have picked up so much more about what was modelled. So are we intentionally living a life where people could model from us even if they don't talk to us? Because that is our role in this chair. We are the story for someone else. And then this is the next generation. Paul speaks in 2 Corinthians 6, I speak to you as a father speaks to his children. He was intentionally building into the next generation of Christians so that they could impact the next generation, they could impact the next, and they could impact the next. Are we doing that as well? First up, who are we intentionally praying for that does not yet know Christ? Do all of us have somebody that God has placed in our hearts that does not yet know him, that we are being intentional at least praying for, at least modelling, and then with God-given bravery and strength and wisdom, talking to? Because we were instructed to go to preach the word to the ends of the earth. That wasn't just for the disciples, that wasn't just for preachers, that was for everybody. So is there somebody for all of us that we could name that we are actively praying for that they would come to know Christ? But secondly, are there younger Christians in the faith? I know for many of us in the congregation that would also be literally younger Christians in the faith. But are there younger people that we can share the experience of our faith with? That we can, like Mark has done for me, that we can intentionally come alongside. What questions do you have of your faith? What questions do you have of God? What questions do you have of the Bible? What problems are you facing that we can find, what would Jesus do in this situation? Are we not only being good evangelists, but also good disciplers to those younger in the faith around us? There are so many years of experience in this church alone that can be passed on to the next generation of believers, like Paul was doing in Corinthians. Are we intentionally doing that? And it obviously won't be written into the Bible. Like, there is no way my parents and Mark's and Danny's story will be written into the Bible. There is no way that my story will be written into the Bible. And there is no way that my friends that I've seen come to Christ, that their story will be written into the Bible. But in heaven, all of those stories will echo for eternity. And here on this earth is the only chance we get to write them. And so as we leave from this place today, I want us to remember these three chairs. I want us to remember the person who came before us, honour them, thank them. Next time you see them, actually say, you know what, thank you for introducing me to this life-changing event. In every situation we go to, I want us to remember that we are somebody else's story and that they are looking on. And I want us to take seriously the call to evangelism and discipleship that we find throughout the Bible and start looking at how our life can impact the next generation of believers. Firstly, by increasing in numbers, and secondly, by impacting them with the wisdom and knowledge that God has given us over the years. And that, I think, is the best way that we can honour all of those narratives that we find in the gospel. And I think that's part of the reason why they were written, so we can take encouragement and then we can be an encouragement to others.